Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session and this talk. I'll mainly be discussing research I did for my master's thesis. This research was funded by the Innovator Grant from the National Center for Atmospheric Research that my advisor at UO, Carolyn received. And the research is titled Narrative Transportation, Emotion, and Climate Change Attitude, Understanding How Map Readers Experience Storytelling Maps. A little background, one of the main topics of this research is climate change, or more specifically, climate change communication. One of the reasons that I wanted to attend the U of O and work with Carolyn is because a lot of her research is focused on climate change and cartography. And I personally have always been very interested and concerned with climate change. I actually wanted to become a climatologist during undergrad. So it might become apparent during this talk that a lot of that has generally influenced my goals with this research, that I just basically want people to care about the crisis and do something about it. And as I did the lit review in climate change communication, I learned that studies show many people actually do believe in climate change. It's just far less are engaged um, and not doing something about it. So yeah, you could argue that climate change engagement is pretty low. And we are cartographers, so we wanted to think about a map's role in this debacle. And maps are a great way at communicating the spatial information of climate change, but this depends on what your definition of great communication is. So one of the main arguments that influenced this project was that maps typically created by climate change scientists or communicators are fairly abstract. It can be a lot of statistical information thrown at the reader, and overall, it's failing to engage and connect the audience with the place in the map. So I don't have a lot of time to go into all the reasons why a reader might not be engaged with these maps, but I'll focus on one possible reason. So during this research, I did all this reading, and I learned that humans typically have two ways of processing information. One's called analytical information processing, and it is the thinking we do that's slow, rational, and effortful. Basically, we have to really focus and think about the information in front of us to understand it. But when we're not processing information this way, and actually most of the time we're not using this way, we're actually engaging in experiential information processing. This one feels easy, it's automatic, and it functions like it sounds. It's learning through experience, and usually happens when we take in information that's rich with emotions and personal experience. And so all this background information leads me to a conclusion that many other researchers have come to, and it's that we need alternative methods of communicating climate change if we want to increase engagement. And one way that has come up in other research is using stories or narratives, because a story can communicate human experience, evoke emotion, be immersive for readers, and even reduce the distance we feel to problems across the globe. And because of all these reasons, stories can be persuasive. Research has demonstrated that stories can even alter our attitudes about things. And of course, that shouldn't be taken lightly. And there's some fascinating research in other fields about the use of stories improving or increasing climate change engagement, but none of that research in cartography really. And this brings me to maps and stories. And I know many listening probably know that maps and stories are no strangers, as narratives and maps have been used throughout history to persuade our thoughts. In other words, maps might not be these objective objects that they appear to be. They can in themselves be persuasive and subjective. And now that's kind of obvious with this map. But as many others have argued, any map made by a human or AI can have bias and typically has a message there to communicate. And then there's this one, it's a good example. Donald Trump added his own data to this map to support where he said the hurricane would go. And this brings me to possibly where the history of maps and stories have come to, and that's this wave of digital map storytelling and how even companies have commercialized the process. like Esri's story map platform, and researchers like Robert Roth have already begun to understand the different types of visual stories we come across and how they function. So as we research storytelling maps, it's an idea like this one from Robert Roth that influenced this research, and it reads, accordingly, visual stories perhaps should be judged less on how efficiently or effectively they are understood or read, but instead how they make the audience feel about and connect to other people and places. To me, this is an idea to break away from cartographic research's historical focus on what a good map is, which was maybe one that where the reader could understand what the data meant in a certain amount of time and so on, but to instead focus on if the map is connecting with the reader or making the reader feel a certain way. And to be clear, the storytelling map created in this research resembles the journalistic style storytelling map, and I used Esri's story map platform because I wanted them to be accessible to other scientists. But I agree, that's just one possible type of storytelling map. So the goal of this research is to better understand how two variables, narrative structure and inclusion of a map, may influence a reader in terms of engagement, emotions, and general attitude change and support for climate change. So that might not mean much with all these specific terms, but basically I wanted to further understand storytelling maps, ones about climate change and how they can be persuasive and how they make readers feel, because I want to help improve climate change engagement. So one element of this that we focused on was level of engagement or narrative transportation. And narrative transportation is one's immersion into a story or the process of being lost in a story. And I'm sure many have felt this while reading a book or watching a movie, because you're basically in another world, you're in the narrative world. And we tried to measure this through the transportation scale, where you ask participants various questions like, I wanted to learn how the narrative ended, or I had a vivid image of blank, which could be a person or place. And to our knowledge, this is the first study that applied the transportation scale to maps to gauge persuasiveness. And another aspect of this research is emotion, and what emotion the reader experienced while viewing the stimuli we created. Emotions are very important to consider when thinking about persuasiveness and narrative transportation, as emotion and cognition are highly linked. We measured this through the Geneva emotion wheel pictured below. This is just one of the many ways, if it's even possible, to truly measure emotion. And we also looked at climate change, attitude change. But in order to understand how a storytelling map or stimuli may influence those three measures, I needed something to compare it to. So I created a few different stimuli and focused on the inclusion or exclusion of maps and also narrative structure. And narrative structure is how story-like something is. Some of the stimuli were more story-like, while others were more informational and abstract. And a high narrative structure is more story-like, while low is less story-like. Okay, moving on to the actual user study that took place. I created a between subjects user study, meaning different participants were exposed to different stimuli. And we focused that participant pool to those residing in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, because that's where a majority of the population lives, but also because they don't directly live on the coast and might not be directly affected by a changing ocean, which is where climate change comes into this project, and also the content of the stimuli. So through the grant that this research was funded through, we met an awesome scientist, Dr. Samantha Seidlecki from the University of Connecticut and former researcher at University of Washington. And one of the problems she's focused on as a biogeochemist is modeling dissolved oxygen levels in the Pacific Ocean, also known as hypoxia, and which raises problems for most marine creatures that use oxygen to survive, which then further affects crab fishers, coastal tribes, and so on that rely on the ocean for their livelihoods. So we collaborated, and I made the content of the maps and text in this study for the stimuli about these low oxygen levels. And part of this research I really enjoyed doing was designing the stimuli. In total, there were 4 stimuli. The 4 can be broken down into 2 main narrative structures, as I mentioned earlier. High meaning more story-like, and low meaning less story-like. And I actually wrote the text to be put into the stimuli. I would have loved to worked with community members in Oregon, but with the pandemic, I ended up just having to create my story, my stimuli. So for the more story-like text for the high narrative, I used this 3-act narrative from Roth 2020 for guidance. And I ended up writing about a fictional story about Alex the fisherman who lives in Newport, Oregon, and he's a crab fisherman struggling with noticing the changes in the ocean he loves and relies on for his income. And here's that narrative arc filled with the specific details of the story I wrote. And for the low narrative structure, which is less story-like, I just did science writing, which included statistics and the processes. And to illustrate the difference between the high and low narrative, I'll briefly read the intro paragraph. So for the high narrative, more story-like, it reads, "To the sound of his alarm, Alex wakes before the sun has risen. He shuffles to the kitchen to pour coffee into his favorite ceramic mug that consists of the browns, greens, and blues of the Oregon coast. He checks the weather forecast from the Coast Guard on his phone," and so on. And the less story-like, low narrative structure reads, "Carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels are the primary cause of a 40% increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations," and so on. So I tried to do typical science writing for that one. And other than there being 2 main narrative structures, there are also 2 main formats, which were text only and map. So here are what some of the maps look like that were put into the stimuli that had maps. They mostly set the location of the story or the science happening. And here are some scientific data about low oxygen levels and climate change. And here's a simple cartoon of the 4 total stimuli we used in this study. To me, the high narrative map represents a storytelling map because you have story-like descriptive text woven into photos and maps. But like I mentioned earlier, it's just one type of possible storytelling map that researchers could focus on. And here is what they actually look like. I use, like I mentioned earlier, I use Esri story map. That's the story-like text alone. And here's the science writing with woven into the maps. And to me, this is the more storytelling map. Okay, so here is the user study design. First, participants were asked questions about their opinions on climate change and low oxygen or hypoxia. And then they get shown a random stimuli to view and read as long as they want. Then they come back and their level of transportation, emotions, and post-climate change and hypoxia attitudes are assessed. And here's an example question from the online user study. This is the one assessing emotion. Okay, so now for the results. I'm going to start with my third research question, which focused on the attitude change. And for climate change attitude, it was the high narrative map or the storytelling map that led to the greatest change in attitude. Attitudes were a little less on board with climate change pre-test, and then they were more post-test. And this was a significant finding. And for hypoxia, they were all significant. So there were significant changes. And this may be because many did not know what hypoxia was before the study. Many already believed in climate change. and perhaps asking them to take action on a smaller aspect of climate change sounded more doable, especially one that's happening in their state. But overall, changing one's feeling about climate change is a pretty difficult thing to do. So the fact that the high narrative map seemed to have led to that change is interesting for future research. Question number 2 focused on emotion. All the stimuli didn't really show any difference. They were all actually stimulated high levels of emotion, which is kind of surprising. And overall, the emotions were negative, which isn't surprising as the stories had a negative tone. And here's each stimuli and a heat map of where they clicked. But yeah, like I said, there were no significant differences between the 4 stimuli and emotion intensity. And lastly, for my first research question, which focused on narrative transportation, surprisingly, all the stimuli generated high levels of transportation. The high narrative map returned the highest level of transportation, but it was not significant. And I'm not sure why there was no significant difference across the 4 stimuli regarding level of transportation. But perhaps all the stimuli were too similar, or perhaps more participants would have changed this, or conducting a study in another way, like a focus group. But it is interesting that the storytelling map changed attitudes, but that none of the stimuli really stood out in terms of emotion and transportation. And one question I'm left with after conducting a study that's like outside the scope of my study is the transportation scale or the way of measuring immersion into a story or stimuli fit for storytelling maps? What about just maps on their own? I applied it to a specific type of storytelling map where text was placed next to a map, but what about story maps where the narrative text is embedded into the map, or a map with no text at all, descriptive text? And so should we use the TS scale when measuring a persuasive map? And as I mentioned earlier, other research has applied the transportation scale to text, videos, and film, but no research has applied it to storytelling maps or even just maps alone. So this leaves future research to decide if we should use this, if you could create your own for maps to gauge the persuasiveness. And even though it's beyond the scope of my research, I'd like to discuss a few more thoughts. So 2 components of narrative transportation are mental imagery formation and cognitive engagement. So some research suggests that texts are better at transporting readers and persuading them because our brains have to do the work to imagine what we're reading, imagine the characters in the setting. While other research says video is better at transportation because we are shown the narrative world that we're entering. But that leaves a big question about what about maps, or more complicated, the many different types of maps. How do they fit? How do they relate to text and videos? But I'll leave it at that and conclude that we need innovative and creative ways to better understand how maps elicit emotion, contain human experience, and persuade readers as more and more cartographers are finding new ways to embed narratives into their work and make maps that inspire action. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great NACIS.